looking at some of the faces on the screen, I think I should have put a tie on. I want to make some prefatory remarks. Firstly, I want to thank the Angus Library, Project Violet, and the Centre for Baptist Studies for inviting me to deliver this lecture about a significant Baptist woman minister who challenged countless stereotypes and, whilst remaining absolutely committed to Baptist identity, nevertheless challenged many of our apparent boundaries, especially in the field of spirituality. If I may, I also want to acknowledge the important part played by various Baptist women in adjusting my own teenage conceptions of ministry and developing in me a deep and abiding commitment to the support and encouragement of women in ministry within our Baptistic tradition. I grew up in the 1960s when many women ministers were almost unheard of. My encounters of women engaging in ministry began as a student when the Yorkshire Baptist Ministers' annual retreat took place at Cober Hill, Scarborough. The ministers used to invite one student from Northern Baptist College, and as a Yorkshire student, my fellow ministerial students decided to pick on me to attend. As a mature student entering college, I was fully supported and had the luxury as a student of running a car. So to my attendance at Cober Hill was added an additional responsibility. I was asked to pick up Sister Evelyn Whitehead, a Baptist deaconess living in a small back-to-back house in the south of Bradford, and transport her to Cober Hill, where she would sit with Sister Ruth Wood from the Manor Estate in Sheffield, and the pair of them would hold court. Sister Evelyn and Sister Ruth both taught me countless important lessons in ministry, and so tonight I remember them with thankfulness. Then at college, we had a Monday evening communion service to which the principal would invite preachers. A memorable occasion sticks out in my mind when the Reverend Ruth Matthews came and preached eloquently and powerfully. She was the first ordained woman Baptist minister I'd encountered and impressed me greatly. Ruth, of course, with Carol McCarthy, whose passing we mourn, marked the dawn of a new era of women trained for ministry within UGB from the very start. Tonight, I'm glad to make a small contribution to the work of friends like Ruth Goulbourne, who set out the challenges and issues of Baptist women ministers in reinventing the wheel in her 1998 Whitley lecture, and updated important concerns in her contribution to the recent Theology Live. For me, it's a privilege to play a small part in uncovering what are sometimes the forgotten stories of women in ministry and in challenging dominant patriarchal historiography. I'm going to attempt now almost the impossible and to share my screen to show some PowerPoint images, hopefully. Margaret Jarman, a British Baptist, was a remarkable woman within the Baptist community, having a number of notable firsts to her name. She grew up in Hall Green, Birmingham, England's second city, attending the Solihull High School for Girls, obtaining her school certificate and leaving school to study at the Northamptonshire Institute of Agriculture with a view to entering the farming sector. She'd grown up in a part of Hall Green, but it was whilst at Agricultural College she attended Moulton Baptist Church, was converted at the age of 18 and baptized as a believer. Having completed her training, she became a herdswoman on a farm and acquired a motorbike to get her from home to farm. However, it was a sermon at Hall Green on 2 Timothy 1, 8-9, which became for her a call to Christian service. Whilst the Baptist Union of Great Britain and Ireland had theoretically ordained women to Christian ministry since 1918, the practical reality in the 1950s was that most women in the Isles were directed towards the Baptist Order of Deaconesses, which had been formed for single women principally to engage in church-related social work. Though by the 1950s, most were serving as minister equivalents in small churches or in various forms of pioneer ministry. At this point, I want to make, for those of you who are joining from other countries and situations, a comment. The first English General Baptists, led by John Smythe and Thomas Helwys, declared there were 2 orders of ministry: bishops, who were to be male, and deacons, who could be both women and men. This position represented a development beyond the magisterial reformers, but something short of the radical Anabaptists. Despite this limited starting point, as John Briggs has demonstrated, on various occasions from the 1600s onwards, women exercised significant ministries in English Baptist churches. Dan Taylor, who was the leader of the new connection of General Baptists in the late 1700s, encouraged the participation of women in every aspect and decision-making parts of the life of the church, though his new connection did not go as far as ordaining women to the gospel ministry. From 1890, the Order of Deaconesses came into being. As Karen Smith has observed, our Baptist foremothers have continued to receive far less attention than their forefathers. From 1890, there were women in the Isles engaged in missional activity in areas of deprivation, spurred on by the initiatives of leading evangelical minister F.B. Meyer. The Order of Deaconesses was now established as a substantial element in the life of Baptists in these islands. Through time, the order moved beyond assisting ministers in large urban churches in their outreach to take responsibility for mission and pioneering causes, often in challenging estate and urban settings. This was the world that Margaret entered. In 1953, she began training as a deaconess at the Baptist Union College for Deaconesses, Struan, where she gained the London University Certificate in Religious Knowledge. After completing her courses, she settled at the Pontusbury group of rural churches in Shropshire. She was recognised as an accredited deaconess of the Baptist Union at the annual assembly in 1959. So far, so typical of the vocational route of women in full-time service to Baptist churches in these islands post-Second World War. Margaret's eyes were open to wider opportunities when she attended the European Baptist Federation Congress in Berlin in 1958. And afterwards she stayed with the Order of German Baptist Deaconesses at their houses in both Berlin and Hamburg. As Margaret reflected on the level of theological formation she'd received at Struan, she thought it was somewhat lacking for the tasks that faced her. So she enrolled for the external London University Bachelor of Divinity degree. In order to do that, she enlisted the help of A.P. Hermit at Selly Oak to prepare her for some of the necessary background, particularly in Old Testament studies and in the biblical languages. Doing the work in the degree as well as looking after churches was a challenge. So in 1961, she entered Spurgeon's College in order to take time out and complete the degree. Though still on the list of deaconesses, she was the first woman to study for theology at Spurgeon's. Of course, she wasn't counted as a ministerial student, and to the best of my knowledge, she still doesn't appear on the Spurgeon's list. Margaret, now serving as a deaconess and having gained her degree, was approached by Ernest Payne, the General Secretary of the Baptist Union, who asked her to join the staff of the Union as organising secretary in the deaconess department. This was a critical phase in the life of the order, as a debate had taken place within the Baptist Union Council about the order and whether, in fact, most deaconesses were really exercising the classic Reformation ministry of word and sacrament and providing key direction and leadership in local churches. That debate was held and the decision was taken to abandon the order of deaconesses. Perhaps the moment was missed for a stronger affirmation of the importance of both women and men serving on the accredited list. Because of her national role, she attended the 1968 World Council of Churches Assembly in Uppsala, Sweden. She represented there the Diakonia network. This was followed by a world trip on behalf of Diakonia, visiting diaconal work in the USA and Australia, and returning home to the Isles via Bangkok and Bombay. In 1969, she attended a Diakonia conference in Finland and also the EBF conference. There is then this ongoing debate about whether at that critical change from having an order of deaconesses to encourage women to train and be ordained to the ministry, that we adequately explored this and convinced our Baptist community that women ministers were a good thing. Coming back to the UK, of course, Margaret was told that there was no longer any need for her service as organising secretary. And she followed other deaconesses in being ordained to the gospel ministry. Her ordination service was perhaps somewhat special. The act of ordination was conducted by Ernest Payne, and George Beasley Murray preached on the occasion. He was then principal of Spurgeon's College. Margaret moved on to become minister at Dalston and Salters Hall Baptist churches. But her role in the union was taken note of. And through her years of service in the local church, she was asked to engage in wider tasks within the Baptist Union. In 1982, Margaret was appointed chair of the Baptist Union Ministerial Recognition Committee, the first woman minister to occupy that post. And the council asked her to become a representative of the Baptist Union on the British Council of Churches and the Free Church Federal Council. As Margaret's ministry developed, she felt a particular vocation to the life of prayer, and in 1983 became an oblate of the community of St. Mary the Virgin at Wantage, an Anglican religious order, where Sister Margaret Magdalene, former BMS missionary Margaret Evening, was a community member. Writing in her diary, she later reflected, "In retrospect, I see that this enrichment of my Baptist tradition began in January 1983. I was due for a sabbatical, and after the closing of a number of doors I had pushed, I finished up having my sabbatical at the convent of the community of St. Mary the Virgin at Wantage. I regarded this as somewhere to be housed and fed whilst I studied, but I received more than I bargained for. I'd never visited a religious community before. Indeed, I'd not even met a sister or a brother. I knew nothing about the life, and it seemed very strange to me. And yet, as soon as I found myself caught up in the rhythm and atmosphere there, I was drawn into the ethos in which prayer was the priority and the journey towards God central." After several weeks, Margaret wrote in her diary, "On reading through my review of that sabbatical, I can see how the seeds of future developments in my spiritual journey began to take shape, and also the theme of my Baptist Union presidency. Profession is a religious, my hermit life had been sown as an idea at the back of my mind, though many years were to pass before it was fulfilled." After this 6-week sabbatical, Margaret wrote, "On my last day, there was a simple service in the chapel during an office, and I became a novice oblate of the community. An oblate is one, while not a member of the community, offers his or her life to God in association with a religious community and lives in that spirit. I was the only Baptist oblate of the CSMV. In my case, the oblate role was adapted for my Baptist tradition. Throughout the following years, Wantage was a great resource for me. I looked through my diaries at all the Wantage visitors thus far, and they totaled 365 days of support." That passage was written later as she contemplated becoming a Baptist religious herself. In 1985, Margaret suffered a severe viral attack, which was to grow worse and was later diagnosed as ME. This was to restrict her physical activities, though not her ministry and her prayer ministry. serving at that time as one of the team in the West Coventry Baptist Fellowship, she felt compelled to retire from that work, but she continued her work for the British Council of Churches and the Free Church Federal Council. If that was a first, becoming an oblate of the community of St. Mary the Virgin, her next first was becoming the first female Baptist minister to assume the vice presidency and then the presidency of the Baptist Union of Great Britain. This is where my own interaction with Margaret's life began. The decision had been taken, much against the advice of some, that the Baptist Assembly might be held in Bradford in 1987. And Margaret was the incoming president. As secretary of the Yorkshire Baptist Association, I was involved in many preliminary meetings with Margaret that led to the assembly being held there. Her theme was prayer and action. I don't think I'm breaking confidences when, having spoken over the years to various ex-presidents of the Union, I found a fairly constant refrain. Keith had a great theme, but when the year was up, nobody was bothered about it anymore. That wasn't the case with Margaret's year. It was a stimulus for the formation of the Baptist Union Retreat Group, a lasting initiative to come out of her presidential year. She, of course, was asked to become the chair of the retreat group, serving from its formation in 1987 through until 1993. Margaret notes on the evening of her presidential address, "My special guests were my mother, my closest friend, and Sister Anne Francis from Wantage. The sight of a religious habit was pretty unusual at a Baptist assembly, but her presence expressed both the support of the community and of the oblates. She was the oblate guardian as well as my spiritual director, and my recognition of the place of Wantage in my life." It was at this time that there was a special edition of the Baptist Quarterly in which Margaret reviewed attitudes to women in ministry in the mid-1980s. As you look back at that edition of the Quarterly, it's interesting to note the other authors of articles in that edition were Carol McCarthy and Ruth Matthews, and an article by the then editor, John Briggs. Margaret was to continue that association with Wantage, and at the conclusion of her presidential year, she suggested to the incoming president, Colin Marchant, that they meet together for a retreat at Wantage, and they asked Michael Walker to conduct that. Margaret, having found help in her sabbatical, being part of a religious community, noted later about this time, "I can see in retrospect the beginnings of an interest in the hermit life. I knew nothing about that, but whenever I saw CSMV sister, a hermit, Christine Ann, there at the Eucharist, I was conscious of something that drew me to her, although, of course, her being a hermit, we never had any conversation." In 1988, after her presidential year, Margaret accepted the call to King Stanley Baptist Church in Gloucestershire part-time. And there she developed her ministry of leading retreats and of spiritual direction, in which she had already developed an interest. For the academic year 1988-89, Margaret took an ecumenical course in spiritual direction held at the National Retreat Centre in London. Her training as a deaconess, her theological education at Spurgeon's had been of the classic conservative evangelical form. But through the course in spiritual direction, she was introduced to other traditions of spirituality, broadening her understanding of prayer, of styles of prayer, of forms of prayer within other traditions. There had been a handful of British Baptist ministers who'd explored other spiritual traditions. But perhaps we can say Margaret paved the way by seeking to enhance her competence both in forms of prayer and in directing others in their life of prayer and ministry. Having been president of the Union seemed to give legitimacy to encourage others in Baptist ministry to explore different Christian traditions of spirituality. Her expertise in this field continued to be strengthened through her link with the community at Wantage. By 1990, the diagnosis of ME was fully confirmed, and Margaret was advised to retire even from her part-time pastoral ministry. A retreat at Wantage gave her opportunity to face the situation in view of her physical limitations and the advice of doctors to retire early on health grounds. Many of you will remember Margaret laid on her camp bed talking to you about different issues. She notes, "It was a time of hollowing out, a facing of the limitations of illness, a choosing of the poverty of powerlessness, a desire to be with Jesus in his earthly experience of limitation and powerlessness, a stripping down to the desire for God himself, an embracing of my situation as a way to be closer to Christ." All of which I can see in retrospect as being a preparation for the Baptist religious life. Margaret, a lifelong Baptist, did consider for a moment whether her future lay with the Anglican community at Wantage, as Margaret Evening had done. But her spiritual director thought this was not on. Margaret was encouraged to remain within the Baptist community. In retirement, she moved into a property provided by the Retired Ministers' Housing Society. Meanwhile, the Baptist Union Retreat Group, which she'd founded in her presidential year, began to explore what a Baptist rule of life might look like, and in 1992 produced a document under her chair, which is now known as the Burford Covenant. As Margaret thought on, she felt a sense of vocation in community. In 1994, Margaret was approached by Evelyn Pretty, a member of a Baptist church in London, who had also been feeling a call to live in community. As Margaret reflected on things, she didn't really see this for herself, but she met regularly with Evelyn to encourage her in exploring this vocation. In 1996, whilst on annual retreat at Wantage, she had another experience and writes in her journal, "I felt Christ inviting me to join in a dance with him, and then to walk and rest with him. It was a time of close fellowship with him. His closeness was cleansing a cavity in me burning off the mess, then filling the space with himself, giving me a gift, a seed, which I was to receive without knowing to what the seed would grow. Through 1996, Margaret continued to reflect on the other persistent call to be a hermit. She did that alongside discussing with Evelyn and others whether there was a place for an intentional residential Baptist community, nevertheless drawing on insights from other Christian communities. She talked with David Coffey and myself about whether such a thing could be understood within the wider Baptist family. And after discussion, I was invited to take on a role with the small group now establishing itself as Baptist visitor. On the 9th of February, Margaret spoke to the London Baptist ministers on a Baptist religious community. This was the first time she'd gone public on the details of the community that was now being considered, the community that was to be called the Prince of Peace, to which Evelyn Pretty and Margaret now felt the need to establish. After much prayer and discussions with David and myself and others, the community of the Prince of Peace was established at Carterton in Oxfordshire, with Margaret and Evelyn being received as postulants at a service in the Anglican Burford Priory. The prior at Burford, Brother Stewart, had been recruited as a consultant. It was beyond my experience to know how to work this out, and we decided we needed some expertise from elsewhere. Brother Stewart proved to be an invaluable friend to the community of the Prince of Peace and a guide and mentor to Margaret in her spiritual journey. Another person then identified themselves as being interested in joining the community, and a search was made for a larger property, which was obtained at Riddings in Derbyshire. Sadly, the small community never grew beyond 3 members, and though there were many good aspects to it, the first Baptist community in England engaged in communal living, Margaret continued to have that hankering at the back of her mind that what God was really saying to her was that she should enter the hermit life. In April 2001, Prior Stewart and myself reviewed the community, and it began to become clear that the community either needed to grow or to change. Sister Evelyn visited the community of the Transfiguration in Australia, the only other known Baptist intentional residential community. She found that stimulating, but we couldn't see the way to achieve quite the same thing in those who were living at Riddings. Eventually, Evelyn, having returned from Australia and feeling that the community was not likely to grow, decided she did not want to proceed to renew her profession and to enter fully into community life. With the withdrawal of Evelyn, the community was no longer viable. We thought long and hard about this. Exploration was made with others who had a sense that community living might be appropriate. There was a particular piece of prophecy that we shared and felt excited by, but that wasn't able to proceed. So it was agreed the community of the Prince of Peace should be dissolved. But Stuart and I, together with advice from a couple of hermits on the Lynn Peninsula, began to explore with Margaret whether that calling she felt from God to be a hermit was truly the case, whether it could be tested and then approved of, and she could be set apart for that ministry. In 2003, Margaret made a profession as a religious at Burford Priory and immersed herself in the life of a hermit. She continued in that vocation, undaunted by her ill health. During a retreat on the Lynn Peninsula in Wales, she commented, "As I approach my 70 years and 10 next month, there's a host of things which I offer to the Lord. Rich wine, plain water, polluted water, opportunities missed, selfish actions, unkind thoughts, thoughtless words and deeds which have harmed others. Lord, take this mixed life, touch it with your transforming spirit, change the significance and meaning of it." Stuart and I both encouraged Margaret to write about her own journey in life. She wrote a chapter for a book on various forms of spirituality that we used with master students in Prague. She began to prepare a record of what she'd been and experienced that could be a resource for others. With the help of Stuart, with the help of the hermits on the Lynn Peninsula, a rule of life for a hermit was established. And in the prayer room at the Hermitage, led by myself as Baptist Union visitor, with Stuart and Sister Pauline Margaret's spiritual director, she made a final commitment. "I, Margaret, in the presence of the whole company and of those here present, do vow to you, Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to live the rest of my life as a religious sister according to my rule of life, and I promise in obedience to your call to serve you in stability, conversion of life, poverty, celibacy, and obedience, by the help of your grace and the bestowal of your gifts all the days of my life." The journey from cowherd to deaconess to minister to community member and hermit was one in which the sense of calling and vocation was always at the forefront of Margaret's mind, a powerful one. It affected and inspired others on the way. And Margaret set out her journey for others now to reflect on. Those from other traditions who talked with Margaret realized that at the heart of it was a deep conviction in the Baptistic way of following Christ. Some reflections then on a pioneering life. For the present, we know that many in our Baptist family across Europe, in her former pastorates, in the ecumenical community, and especially in the religious communities and the family of hermits in these islands, have given thanks for Margaret, recalling her spirit of determination despite the onset of a debilitating illness. They also recall her determination to remain firmly within the Baptist tradition, illustrated by her insistence of having a Baptist visitor both to the community and in her later life as a hermit. To constantly feel linked in and valued by British Baptists, this was a persistent mark of her life. Her founding of the Baptist Union Retreat Group, her dedicated role as chair and then later consultant, ensured the group flourished and grew as part of the British Baptist scene. Her work as a spiritual director led many into her orbit. However, there being no resource available to her of Baptistic models of community life and none of the life as a hermit, meant that she perhaps at moments had to rely unduly on the Anglo-Catholic communities to advise and shape the rule of life and the lifestyle of a hermit. A review and analysis of her papers, of the community of the Prince of Peace, and her interaction with those who are members of the community is a work that still awaits us. Whatever future reflection and research shows, I present to you a woman with an absolute commitment to Christ, a desire to serve the wider church and the Baptist denomination through a life focused on prayer, who seized opportunities which others did not take and left an indelible imprint on the people she came into contact with, whether as a deaconess, a minister, a spiritual director, a community member, or in that life of prayer as a hermit. Today, British Baptists are training and ordaining many more women than in the 1960s, and that is to be applauded. It's not unusual to have a woman exercising full ministerial leadership in many of our Baptist churches. But for Margaret and those of her generation, it was a pioneering role, and we thank God for them.
Thank you so much, Keith. That was such an interesting talk, and Margaret Jarman is such a fascinating woman, and I'm sure everybody here this evening agrees that the story of her spiritual journey through so many different changes was just incredible, really, really interesting. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody this evening has got some interesting questions to ask Keith. Maybe we can just go away, stretch our legs for a little bit for 5 minutes or so, maybe make a cup of tea, and we can reconvene here in about 5 minutes time, which according to my watch will be at roughly 8:30. And so we'll see you all back then about 8:30. Thank you very much. Well, it's 8:30, and I hope everybody's had a chance to have that cup of tea. And I can see some interesting questions here for Keith. So as Chris said, if you'd like to ask your question, if you could please tap it into the chat facility, and then I can come to you and ask you to unmute and ask your question. So just going back through the questions, I think the first question comes from Chris Joins, and I'm very interested on this as well about the Deaconess movement. So Chris, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great.
Well, thank you, Keith, for a fabulous insight into Margaret Jarman's life and work and calling, which was very poignant and moving. I wondered if you could just say a few words about what her reaction was at the point when the Deaconess movement was it was decided to wind up the Deaconess movement, because I know that different people had different responses to that, didn't they?
Obviously it was some years afterwards when I talked to Margaret on just one occasion really about that period of life in the Union. Obviously, at one level, she could see that meant the end of her job at Baptist House. And at another level, and I think this was illustrated hopefully in the talk, she'd felt a dissatisfaction with what the training she'd been offered at Struan. She was critical of that. She'd sought to gain more ministerial formation and the London BD, because as far as she could see, the work that she was called to do at Pontisbury and then at Dalton and Salters Hall and so on was the work of ministry. So I think the bit she missed, and of course was a recurring theme then in her life, was the sense of community that the Order of Deaconesses had, as opposed perhaps to the, amongst many Baptist ministers, that solo individuality. She regretted that, but she thought it was entirely right and proper. She'd seen diaconal work in various parts of the world and saw that that was quite distinct in one way, whereas British Baptists were tending in almost every instance to ask deaconesses to do the work of a minister. She did reflect a little bit in, had we lost something by those original insights of F.B. Meyer and so on, of a group of people dedicated to social work beyond the local church and so on. But in terms of her own experience, she thought it was quite right that she should be ordained as a minister, because that's what she'd been doing. And that's, at that point in her life, what she felt called to do.
That's really interesting to hear, because we have the archive of the Deaconess Order in the Angus, and when I look at that, I get such a strong sense of community.
Yeah,
as you're saying, such a strong sense of community and also of ministry as well. You know, going by described in other ways, but really it was ministry. So I think that's very interesting. Thank you. The next question is from Margaret. Margaret, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Keith your question?
Yes. Oh, hello. Yes, thank you very much for tonight. I find all sorts of links with what you were saying. And I'm just wondering if, you know, she ever talked about her experience going to Serampore. And, you know, that was one of the original Baptist communities in a way, not in a monastic sense, but very much you know, very much a community as we would recognize it today. And I just wonder if she ever reflected on that to you.
Yeah, just a little bit, Margaret. She was somebody who, through this experience of being the organizing secretary and then having the chance to travel as part of Diaconia and the WCC, including the visit to Serampore, she was a great person for picking things up and working with them. So she understood that about what had been there in the intention of Serampore. Perhaps later, after the Wantage experience, her own thoughts about community looked rather more to the Anglo-Catholic tradition than to what she'd experienced elsewhere. I mean, obviously, the German deaconesses at that time were often living in community houses, so she got some understanding of that. The same with the sense of community at Serampore. But she, in the end, I think Wantage was the primary influencer.
Thank you.
The next question is from Vanessa. Vanessa, would you like to unmute and ask Keith your question?
Hi Keith, lovely to see you. That was fascinating. I hadn't realised that Margaret became a hermit. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that was actually like for her? Yeah, incredible story, thank you.
Yeah, the guidance from the hermits on the Llyn Peninsula was quite specific, and to a large extent Margaret followed that, which is she cut herself off from the surrounding society community. You could write to Margaret, and I've most of her correspondence here, which I'm depositing in the Angus in due course. But you couldn't, she had a telephone, but that was an emergency telephone, so you couldn't ring her and she wouldn't answer. She'd write orders for food and so on that were left outside the cottage, picked up by local tradespeople who delivered to the door, and then when they'd gone away, she would take the food in. So it was very isolated form of life. She loved to hear from people, and she had a wall which was a pinboard wall on which prayer requests and a chart of people she prayed for on particular days. She knew that Wednesdays in Prague was the day we gathered round the table and had the Eucharist together. So on Wednesday mornings, I always knew that Margaret was praying for us. She wanted the list of students each year and their countries they came from, so that would be part of her prayer life. So it was a very isolated form of life. I mean, Margaret's temperament was appropriate for that, but very, very limited contact face-to-face with other human beings. And as I say, I mean, the focus of the life of a hermit is a life of prayer. So the whole day was divided up into prayer portions and so on. She would listen to the news on the radio once in an evening, and that helped create her prayers for the world.
That's so interesting. I mean, I wonder whether or not, do you think that she found her peace there? Do you think that it was what she thought and hoped it was going to be?
That's my feeling. I mean, I pressed her to write down her experiences of being a hermit, both as I think of it, the possibility, what she imagined it would be, and the reality. And those papers are not as extensive as I would have liked, but we do have the papers that record her thoughts on all of that.
So interesting to read those. So the next question is from David Boydell. So David, if you'd like to unmute your question.
Yes, I hope it's working this time. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yes, you can. Good, because I had problems last time. Okay, well, I think you've partly answered my question, but thank you for this excellent talk, Keith. This is very, very interesting. And greetings from down under, where I am now.
Thank you.
Margaret wrote any reflections about her life as a hermit, and also as one who has someone with ME in the family. I was wondering if she wrote anything about living with ME.
Yes, as I said, she has a document on life as a hermit, and then another document I got her to write, the route to final profession as a Baptist religious sister, which goes on to talk about her time as a hermit. Yeah. We haven't anything in writing specifically about her ME, though of course at critical moments a lot of the day had to be spent laying on this camp bed, and if before she made her final profession as a hermit, the occasions I visited, I mean, that would, if we had a talk and she was laid on the camp bed, then we'd have to stop and I would go for a walk or something just to give her some recovery time. So it was very debilitating for her, but didn't stop her being really, she knew what was going on in the Baptist world, and, you know, as the focus of her prayers and so on, she was very engaged with all of that, despite living this somewhat isolated life.
Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. So the next question is from Ruth. Ruth, if you'd like to unmute and ask Keith your question.
I think that's this Ruth. I think Ruth is the name on this particular Zoom call. And as Keith mentioned Ruth Matthews earlier, so we've nearly got the full set, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for that, Keith. Lovely to see you and hear you on talking about Margaret, and you know that my and her past sort of interwove in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
And I had reason to be grateful for her prayers, particularly when I chaired BU Council. As an ex-president, she was one of those who got all the papers. That was in the days when ex-presidents were permanently on council. And I would often get a note before council, and she may not have ever been at council meetings, but you could guarantee she had read all the papers, and she would drop me a note as chair and say that she would be praying for us in those meetings.
That was very important for her to keep that link and engagement with council, and I mean she was so delighted that several of the women ministers, like Ruth Matthews, who succeeded her as chair of MR, yourself with GP and then council, she followed what you were doing with great interest and great commitment to pray for you and Ruth and others in the ministries you undertook in the life of the Union.
But I noticed that you said that it was perhaps not surprising that the First Baptist community drew heavily on the Anglo-Catholic tradition. And I just wonder whether if we were starting a Baptist community now, whether it would be very different. The Northumbrian community is well known amongst us. Yeah. There are the other new monastic movements. Yeah. You know, was that, she was a pioneer, but actually, is it inevitable that the first pioneers can't differentiate enough from what they have to draw on?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating point, of course, because I've been quite involved with Roy Searle and the Northumbria community, and you know, seeing how that developed and Roy's early vision when he was nobbut a lad, you know, this concern for the old kingdom of Northumbria and how the gospel could come alive again in that. Yeah, I think Margaret she was a bit caught, and because she'd stumbled on St Mary the Virgin, the Wantage community, and that had been such a help to her that became her focus. We could talk about these others as other types of community began to emerge, but really I think she was rather caught with because she felt a strong sense of support from St Mary the Virgin. You know, it perhaps was something that limited her vision to see how other forms of community, which she appreciated, she talked about positively, but she couldn't quite take on board for herself. I think that would be a fair comment.
Thank you.
So another Ruth, this time Ruth Goldburn. Ruth, do you want to make the comment that you've written down? Do you want to just comment on what you've said?
I've forgotten which comment. I've sent a couple of comments in. I commented that all the deaconesses I've ever spoken to have said that about community, that sense of community. And okay, if I can take the comment a little bit further, I'm absolutely fascinated by what you're saying tonight, Keith, and I really wanted to hear about Margaret. Margaret was president the year I came south, and I came south partly to get married, but partly, don't ask me to choose between these two, because this was a denomination that would accept women into ministry. And I wrote to Margaret as a terribly naive, 21-year-old, saying, I want to be a Baptist minister, what do I do? And she was incredibly helpful and encouraging. And pointed me in the right direction. But talking about the deaconess movement, I have all of Barbara Stanford's archive. And Barbara never wanted to be anything other than a deaconess. No. And Ernest Payne referred to her as the last deaconess standing. Yeah. And she didn't get around to being ordained until the 1990s because she was a deaconess and she didn't want to be a minister. And I think there is a real history to be written here, and I need help. Is kind of what I'm saying, because I've got Barbara's stuff, you've got Margaret's stuff. There's a whole lot. There is some stuff in the archive. Does anybody know of anybody who's working on the deaconesses in a major way? And would they like to talk to me, and I can talk to them about Barbara, or is there a major work to be done here?
I mean, I think there's a major work to be done, and it could be something, you know, I mean, you're pretty well in a position to do it. I can offer some insights from the two I mentioned at the beginning. I can tell you quite a bit about them. It would be lovely to know if there were other papers on some of these very significant women who, in some cases, took on Herculean tasks in establishing new churches on estates and so on, and gave themselves to the work in a quite tremendous way. I mean, going back to my comments about Evelyn and Ruth Wood at the beginning, I mean, they were quite scathing when you got them together, of some of the younger Baptist ministers in the north. You know, well, they don't know, you know, they don't know the half of it. They're not up to this, and of course they both were, and had outstanding ministries. But yeah,
my current the church I currently serve had a deaconess, and people there's a folk memory of her, and I really want to find out more. But that attitude is there as well. She was the one who really got us going, really got us started, and I've come across that. And yet I also met some deaconesses when I was interviewing them, and I've got them on tape, going, yes, but you women going into ministry were the ones who were really doing it, and that made me so uncomfortable.
Yeah,
because I thought that they had done such amazing pioneer, you know, talking to some of our pioneers now, thinking this was what they were doing. Pioneer work on the estates and in difficult places. Yeah, thank you.
So we'll have another name apart from Ruth now. So I didn't know whether, Caroline, you wanted to make your comment as well about the prayer letter for the deaconesses.
It was more a matter of observation to Ruth's that I'm still in touch with the person who does their I'm not sure if it's half yearly or quarterly prayer letter, but it's just incredible that all this time onwards they still actually have their own prayer letter and newsletter and are still in touch, the limited number of them that are remaining. So Keith, long time no see, not really a question, just a comment of observation.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you can't get past that. There's such a sense of community in the order of deaconesses, and the care they had for one another was quite exceptional, really, in our Baptist world.
And I think as well, you know, their incredible selflessness, from what I've read, the fact that they were prepared to do the things that their male counterparts or superiors at that time were not prepared to do. And yet, you know, get much less recognition and much
less pay.
Yes, much less payment. Yeah. Ruth Bottoms, I didn't know whether or not you wanted to say your comment aloud as well, just about what you're saying about the history of the deaconesses as well.
Just adding, because that's the way the conversation was going, to adding it into chat. And I currently work for the West London Mission, and a Methodist set up and was founded in 1887. I'm fascinated to read their story of these Sisters of the Poor, and what they did going into workhouses, prisons, the tenement blocks, and it was for single women who were of any denomination. In those early days, they were very ecumenical, really, considering it was set up by the Methodists. And I know there were quite a lot of links with them, some of the early movements that eventually became our deaconess order, certainly in London. So yeah, there's just lots we don't fully know about, or I don't fully know about, but you stumble across these links in different places.
And I know from my point of view, working in the Angus, that we do occasionally have people who will come in and do work on particular deaconesses. So they'll single out particular people that they're interested in. But there hasn't really been anything sort of attempted about the movement as a whole, generally. So Carol, I don't know whether or not you wanted to say your comment, if you wanted to unmute and say what you've written.
Thanks, Emily, and hi, Keith.
Hi.
Great to see you. Yeah. Yes, I think, you know, the time is now, especially if we want to tap in to those deaconesses who are still around and still active, maybe not in the leadership positions that they were, but still very much active in the Baptist scene. And so, yeah, sooner rather than later, if somebody will pick up that challenge. Ruth Goodburn.
If I may unmute for
another
a minute.
one to add to the list, Ruth.
I was just thinking, there's our next oral history project. I have some I have some interviews with deaconesses, and then it kind of ran into the ground because I became unwell. But I wonder, we now have an active oral history group, and our last meeting, we did say, what should we be doing next? And I wonder if this might be, following the pattern we've got of the two projects going, if this might be something. Anyway, that's for the group.
Can I just ask a question as well, Keith, just about the Prince of Peace, the community? Was there a great sense of sadness when the decision was made that that wasn't going to go forward? Was that a very difficult time?
Yes, yeah. I think especially for Evelyn, who had been the one who carried this sense of vocation for quite a few years before she dared approach Margaret to discuss it with Margaret. But it couldn't seem to break out of its constricted way. And that might, I mean, so everything was discussed endlessly about the form of the community, the worship pattern of the community and so on. It didn't attract essentially younger people, which I think it needed to do. And that was the view Brother Stuart and I came to, that unless it could do that, it hadn't a future. And when Evelyn came back from experience the community in Australia, which is vibrant, you know, there was especially for her, a spirit that this was all very, very sad and not what she'd dreamed of. For Margaret, it was a bit more tinged because she'd always had, for many years, this sense what she really felt a calling to be was a hermit. So this was a stop on the way to help others. And when it didn't work out, she wasn't just as disappointed.
Thank you for that. One more question, I think, from Chris. Chris, would you like to ask Keith your question?
Yeah, I just wondered, Keith, if, you know, following on from that comment, really, that I was really struck by the kind of emphasis on community that seems to have emerged with the kind of deaconess phase, and then the kind of hermit side seems to be the opposite extreme. And yeah, if you could just say something about that sort of relationship.
It's a complicated story in Christian history, isn't it? And Margaret, the article is here somewhere, wrote an article on hermits in Christian history, which, yeah, it's on the papers on the floor. But I mean, what the point she recognised, and this is what she couldn't have in the end, and what the hermits on the Llyn Peninsula talked about, was that, of course, all these hermits were part of a community. It's just that they lived their lives connected to the community in a different way to the others. So I don't think any of the Anglo-Catholic hermits on the Llyn Peninsula, for instance, are isolated in the sense that they're not part of some larger community that occasionally they worship with and pray with and break bread with. But it's a sort of vocation beyond. And looking back in church history, that seems to be the pattern. So there's something, and I haven't teased this out. I wouldn't want to go much further than that in my comments, but there will be people who understand that better, how the life of a hermit somehow needs to be rooted in a community. Ruth in the chat is giving a famous quote from Life Together, Bonhoeffer's marvellous book that was my guiding light in Prague.
Well, thank you very, very much, Keith. And thank you everybody here this evening for coming tonight. I'm sure we'll all agree that it was a really, really interesting talk about such a fascinating woman, just so interesting. I don't know of any other Baptist hermit. I have never come across another Baptist, so it was just very, very interesting. So thank you very much. And I'm sure everybody would like to show their virtual appreciation with a virtual hand clap. Thank you so much, Keith. And
It's been my pleasure.